Welcome back to Upgrade to General, a series to help you upgrade your amateur radio license to General Class. And I'm Ron Call, KE7CR. This is episode G1, Commission's Rules, Question Set A. So let's jump in to sub-element G1. When we talk about Commission's rules, what commission are we talking about? Well, that would be the Federal Communications Commission, or the FCC. The FCC is the agency of the federal government that regulates the radio spectrum in the United States, and Part 97 of the FCC code regulates the amateur radio service. They're part of the ITU, or the International Telecommunications Union, and by treaty, the United States works with other countries to regulate the radio spectrum so there's not interference between countries. Now, not every country is a part of that union, but most countries are, and we abide by reciprocal agreements a lot of times. So if you have a ham radio license in the United States and we have a reciprocal agreement with another country, you can operate in that country. Let's go ahead and jump into question 1. On which HF and or MF amateur bands are there portions where general class licensees cannot transmit? This question is asking about HF and MF bands, and it's important to know what they're talking about. What are these bands? Okay, those are the frequencies that you have the privileges to operate on. If you're watching the video, you can see this image of the U.S. amateur radio bands. This is a nice graphic that's on the ARRL's website. You can print it out, put it on your own ham shack wall. I have a copy on my wall. I always refer to it. If you go to the ARRL's homepage, arrl.org, and then just up at the top right, there's a website search. Search for band plan. It gives you a few results. One of them is the U.S. amateur radio bands. If you click on that link, it brings up this PDF graphic of all of the bands. Now, the bands are measured in meters. That's the wavelength of the radio waves. Or you can refer to them by frequency. And you need to know both. Let me teach you a quick way to match which band matches with which frequencies. The original or most common amateur radio bands that you have on HF, which stands for high frequency, is 80 meters, 40 meters, 20 meters, 15 meters, and 10 meters. I always start with 80 meters. It matches up with 3.5 megahertz. Now here's the trick. If you go 80 meters and jump to 40 meters, you've cut your wavelength in half. The key is, if you cut your wavelength in half, you double the frequency. That's the relationship. Frequency is the inverse of wavelength. So 40 meters, we would double 3.5 megahertz to get 7 megahertz for 40 meters. If we cut our wavelength in half again to 20 meters, we would double 7 meters and get 14 megahertz for 20 meters. Again, half of 20 meters is 10 meters, so we would double 14 megahertz and it becomes 28 megahertz for 10 meters. Now 15 is kind of odd. It's in the middle there. It's in between 20 and 10. So you just take, well, what's in between 14 and 28? 21 megahertz. So these are our main amateur radio bands. There are more bands that have been added. 160 meters, 30 meters, 17 and 12 meters, and some others we'll get to in a minute. Take 160 meters. Well, if you start with 80 meters and it's 3.5 megahertz, we've doubled 80 to 160, so we'll have to cut the frequency from 3.5 in half, roughly, and we get 1.8 megahertz. For 30 meters, that's in between 40 and 20, so it's going to be between 7 megahertz and 14. About halfway between there, we have 10 megahertz. 17 meters in between 20 and 15, so we're going between 14 megahertz and 21 megahertz, you get 18 megahertz. 12 meters, that's going to be between 15 and 10 meters. So that's between 21 megahertz and 28 megahertz. We get 24 megahertz for 12 meters. We don't have a half of 10 meters to get a 5 meter band. Instead, we have a 6 meter band. So instead of doubling 28 and getting 56, it's going to be a little less than that. So a 6 meter band is 50 megahertz. And we don't have a 3 meter band. We have a 2 meter band instead. So instead of just doubling 50 to 100, the 2 meter band ends up being about 145 megahertz. And then we have a 70 centimeter band, which is 440 megahertz. Now the question talked about the HF and or MF band. HF is high frequency, MF is, you guessed it, medium frequency. See, originally the radio spectrum was divided into low frequency, medium frequency, and high frequency. Actually, the 160 meter band is part of the medium frequency band. The medium frequency band is anything between 300 kilohertz to 3000 kilohertz or 3 megahertz. And a trick is always divide these sections up into threes. From 3 megahertz to 30 megahertz is the HF band. From 30 megahertz to 300 megahertz is the very high frequency band, or VHF. And then from 300 megahertz to 3000 megahertz, which is 3 gigahertz, is the ultra high frequency band. Above that, from 3 gigahertz to 30 gigahertz, would be the super high frequency band. Hens have privileges on all of these bands and more. There are low frequency bands, and beyond the super high frequency bands you get microwave bands up into light. But these frequencies and bands and divisions are what you need to know for the question on the general class exam. So back to our question. On which HF and or MF amateur bands are there portions where the general class licensees cannot transmit? On 80, 40, 20, and 15, there are portions where only extra class operators have access. All the other bands, generals can operate the entire range of frequencies on those bands. Next question. On which of the following bands is phone operation prohibited? If you look on the US band plans chart, 30 meters is a data-only band. Now data can include CW or Morse code, RTTY RTTY or radio teletype, or any of the other digital modes. Next question. On which of the following bands is image transmission prohibited? Image transmission, like slow scan television, takes such large bandwidths, is not allowed on 30 meters. Question 4. Which of the following amateur bands is restricted to communication only on specific channels rather than frequency ranges? Now if you look on the chart, 60 meters shows little slices, little channels. We're not allowed to operate continuously throughout 60 meters, just on those little channels instead of continuously. Next question. On which of the following frequencies are general class licensees prohibited from operating as control operator? If you look on 80, 40, 20, and 15 meters, there are sections that are not allowed to general class. On each of those bands, the lower end of the band, towards the lower frequencies, are reserved for extra class operators. Say for example on 80 meters, the band starts from 3.5 megahertz and goes to 4.0 megahertz. From 3.5 to 3.25, that small slice is reserved only for extra class operators, and that's the data portion of the band. You hear extra class operators there on CW and some of the data modes, but generals are not allowed there. The phone and image portion, or voice portion of the band, typically where operators are operating single sideband, that starts at 3.6 megahertz, but generals are not allowed to start operating until they get to 3.8 megahertz. So from 3.6 to 3.8, that's reserved for extra class operators. And the idea here was to try to motivate people to upgrade their license class, learn more, get more privileges. But most of the band is available to general class. General class gives you a huge jump in all of the frequencies you have available to you. But there are some slices on 80, 40, 20, and 15 meters that are reserved only for extra class. Those portions, the low end of the bands and the low end of the voice portion of the bands. For this question, the answer choices, choice A is 7.125 megahertz to 7.175. Choice B, 28.0 to 28.025. However, 28 megahertz, that's the 10 meter band, so all of that's available for general class operators. Choice C was 21.275 megahertz to 21.30 megahertz. That is the upper portion of the 15 meter phone band, so that's available to general class operators. And choice D says all of the above. We've already noted that B is an incorrect answer because general class operators can operate on all of 10 meters, and C was the upper portion of the band, so that doesn't qualify. So the answer is A. That 7.125 to 7.175, that's the lower portion of the phone band of 40 meters, so that's not allowed for general class. Next question. Which of the following applies when the FCC rules designate the amateur service as a secondary user on a band? Now, secondary users means that there are other services, other radio services that have first access to that band. That's their band. We get to use it as long as we don't cause any problems. But if they're using it and there's some interference that we're getting, we just have to accept that interference. So One of the answer choices is amateur stations must not cause harmful interference to primary users and must accept interference from primary users, and that's the correct answer. Next question, on which amateur frequencies in the 10-meter band may stations with a general class control operator transmit CW emissions? Now, CW is allowed across all amateur bands, the entire band. However, normally good operating procedures, it's usually the lower portions of those bands, the lower frequency portions of those bands where you'll hear CW. Technically it's allowed, but nobody transmits CW on the upper portions of the bands because nobody else is listening for it up there. But technically you need to know the answer is the entire band. On 10 meters you can transmit the entire band. Next question, which HF bands have segments exclusively allocated to amateur extra licenses? Again, it's kind of a rephrasing of one of the former questions. 80, 40, 20, and 15 meters all have sections only for extra class operators. Next question, which of the following frequencies is within the general class portion of the 15-meter band? Let me give you the answer choices and you'll see how to approach questions like this. Choice A is 14,250 kilohertz. So that's the same as 14.250 megahertz. Well, 14 megahertz, that's the 20-meter band, so that's not part of, that can't be the answer. The question asks about the 15-meter band, not the 20-meter band, so choice A is wrong. Choice B, 18,155 kilohertz, same as 18.155 megahertz. That's the 17-meter band, so that's not part of the 15-meter band. That's out. Can't be choice B. Choice C, 21,300 kilohertz. Oh, 21 megahertz, that is the 15-meter band. Choice D is 24,900 kilohertz. Well, 24.9 megahertz, that's part of the 12-meter band. So the only answer choice that has any of the 15-meter band is choice C, which is the correct answer. What portion of the 10-meter band is available for repeater use? This is one you just have to memorize. The upper portion of the band. So the answer is the portion above 29.5 megahertz. 10 meters is an interesting band. It's kind of on that borderline between HF and VHF. Sometimes it acts almost like a VHF band. It's a little bit different. And there are repeaters on 2 meters. And as a technician, you're probably familiar with some of the repeaters. 10 meters can be similar to that. So it's the upper portion, the portion above 29.5 megahertz, is available for repeater use. And the last question, when general class licensees are not permitted to use the entire voice portion of a band, which portion of the voice segment is available to them? Remember, the upper portion of the band is what's available for generals. So again, it's on 80, 40, 20, and 15 meters. The generals have some segments that are not allowed, and the parts that are allowed are the upper frequency portions of those. All right. Hope you got a lot out of this section, this first podcast, and looking forward to seeing you in the next one. 73, this is KE7CR.